There are few peoples in the ancient world whose reputation has traveled so far beyond history itself as the Philistines. Their name has survived for more than 3,000 years. Yet for most people today, that name carries an image that is surprisingly disconnected from the people who actually lived in the ancient Near East. In modern language, calling someone a Philistine often means describing them as someone who has little appreciation for art, culture, or learning. It has become an insult, but that reputation did not come from archaeology. It did not come from the writings of the Philistines themselves. It came largely from one source, the Hebrew Bible. Within the biblical narrative, the Philistines appear again and again as the principal rivals of the Israelites. They are portrayed as powerful enemies. They are depicted as military threats. They stand behind some of the Bible's most memorable stories. Goliath towers over the battlefield before being defeated by the young David. Delilah betrays Samson after discovering the secret of his strength. Philistine armies clash repeatedly with Israelite tribes. Their cities become symbols of danger. Their rulers are presented as arrogant and oppressive. Over centuries, these stories became deeply influential across much of the world. As a result, many people came to know the Philistines only through the perspective of those who considered them enemies. Yet history is rarely that simple. Ancient societies often described their rivals in the darkest possible terms. Victorious kings celebrated themselves while portraying defeated enemies as cruel, barbaric, or morally corrupt. Religious texts emphasize divine favor toward one community and divine judgment against another. None of this is unusual in the ancient world. Egyptians did it. Assyrians did it. Babylonians did it. Greeks and Romans would later do the same. Every civilization shaped stories that reinforced its own identity. The biblical authors were no different. That does not mean the biblical accounts have no historical value. Far from it. They preserve traditions, names, places, political struggles, and memories that often intersect with archaeology. But they represent only one side of a much larger story. The challenge for historians is to separate historical information from literary purpose. They ask difficult questions. Which details reflect actual events? Which details were shaped by theology? Which stories preserve genuine memories of the Iron Age? Which were written centuries later to explain the identity of Israel and Judah? These questions do not always have easy answers. The greatest obstacle is that the Philistines themselves left almost no written history behind. Unlike the Egyptians, they did not cover temple walls with long royal inscriptions. Unlike the Assyrians, they did not leave vast libraries filled with military campaigns and administrative records. Unlike the Babylonians, they did not preserve thousands of clay tablets describing daily life. Their own voice is almost silent. For generations, this silence allowed the biblical image to dominate nearly every discussion about them. But over the last century, archaeology has steadily transformed that picture. Excavations across southern Israel have uncovered cities, houses, workshops, temples, pottery, food remains, tools, jewelry, and countless everyday objects. Each discovery has added another small piece to an enormous puzzle. Slowly, an entirely different image has begun to emerge. Instead of finding a society without culture, archaeologists discovered sophisticated urban centers. Instead of finding isolated warriors, they found skilled craftsmen, farmers, merchants, builders, and artisans. Instead of discovering a civilization disconnected from its neighbors, They found one deeply involved in the cultural exchanges that defined the Eastern Mediterranean at the dawn of the Iron Age. The more evidence researchers uncovered, the more mysterious the Philistines became. Rather than answering every question, archaeology often raised new ones. Where had these people come from? Why did their pottery look different from that of surrounding communities? Why did certain architectural styles resemble buildings hundreds of kilometers away across the sea? Why did elements of their diet differ from neighboring populations? Why did aspects of their material culture seem both foreign and local at the same time? To answer those questions, historians must first understand the world into which the Philistines appeared. Around the end of the 13th century before Christ, the Eastern Mediterranean entered one of the greatest periods of upheaval in ancient history. For centuries, powerful kingdoms had dominated the region. Egypt ruled vast territories along the southern Levant. The Hittite Empire controlled much of Anatolia. Great Mycenaean kingdoms flourished across mainland Greece. Cities from Cyprus to Syria traded luxury goods across enormous distances. Copper from Cyprus traveled to workshops throughout the Mediterranean. Tin from distant lands combined with copper to produce bronze. Merchants carried ivory, wine, oils, textiles, precious stones, timber, and fine ceramics from one kingdom to another. This interconnected system had created extraordinary prosperity, but also created vulnerability. Because every major kingdom depended upon many others, disruption in one region could quickly spread across the entire network. Then, during the late 13th and early 12th centuries before Christ, that network began to collapse. Cities burned, palaces were abandoned, trade routes disappeared, entire kingdoms vanished from history. The mighty Hittite Empire disintegrated. Many Mycenaean palaces fell into ruin. Urban populations declined across large parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. Writing systems disappeared in some regions for centuries. Historians still debate exactly why this happened. Some researchers point toward prolonged drought. Others argue that earthquakes damaged important cities. Some emphasize famine and social unrest. Others highlight economic breakdown. Still others focus on warfare and large-scale migrations. Increasingly, many scholars believe multiple causes interacted at the same time. Environmental stress weakened societies already dependent upon fragile trade networks. Political instability encouraged rebellion. Population movements intensified existing conflicts. One crisis fed another until entire civilizations collapsed. Among the many mysteries surrounding this period is a group known from Egyptian records as the Sea Peoples. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions describe foreign groups arriving from across the sea. They fought both on land and at sea. Some traveled with families, wagons, and possessions. Others appear as heavily armed warriors. Their exact identities remain debated even today. They may not have formed a single united people at all. Instead, they may have consisted of numerous different groups moving independently during a time of widespread instability. The most important Egyptian evidence comes from the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III. During the early 12th century before Christ, Egypt faced major invasions from both western Libya and the northeastern Mediterranean. Massive reliefs carved into the walls of the mortuary temple at Medinet Habu depict dramatic battles. Ships collide upon the Nile Delta. Archers fire arrows from crowded decks. Soldiers fight hand-to-hand. Captives are marched before the victorious pharaoh. Accompanying inscriptions identify several groups among the attackers. One of those names appears as the Pele set. For many historians, that name closely resembles the later Hebrew word from which the English word Philistine ultimately developed. Although absolute certainty remains impossible, most scholars identify the Pele set of the Egyptian inscriptions with the people later known as the Philistines. If this identification is correct, then the Philistines first appear in surviving written history not as settled inhabitants of Canaan, but as participants in one of the greatest periods of migration and political upheaval in the ancient world. The Egyptian reliefs also provide remarkable visual details. The Pele set were distinctive feathered or plumed headdresses unlike those typically shown for Egyptian soldiers. Their shields are large and rounded. Their clothing differs noticeably from local styles. Artists clearly intended to portray them as foreigners. Yet these reliefs raise almost as many questions as they answer. Where exactly had these people come from? Were they invaders seeking new lands? Refugees fleeing collapsing kingdoms? Mercenaries serving shifting alliances? Entire communities forced to migrate after political disasters elsewhere? Or some combination of all these possibilities? The answers remain uncertain. For much of the 20th century, many historians imagined a dramatic invasion. According to this older interpretation, warriors from the Aegean swept across the eastern Mediterranean, destroyed cities throughout the Levant, defeated local populations, and established themselves as rulers over southern Canaan. It was an exciting story. It also fit neatly alongside biblical descriptions of conflict. But archaeology gradually complicated that picture. Excavations at many sites expected to show widespread destruction instead revealed continuity. Some cities certainly experienced violence. Others did not. In several places, new forms of pottery appeared without evidence that earlier populations had been exterminated or expelled. Local traditions continued alongside newly introduced customs. Rather than replacing one culture with another overnight, the archaeological record suggested something far more gradual and far more human. Communities mixed, traditions blended, local populations adapted to newcomers. New arrivals adopted local practices. Cultural identities evolved over generations rather than emerging fully formed in a single moment. This has led many scholars to rethink what the Philistines actually were. Instead of imagining one massive migration from a single homeland, researchers increasingly envision a diverse collection of people arriving from different parts of the Eastern Mediterranean during a time of regional crisis. Some may indeed have originated in the Aegean. Others may have come from Cyprus. Some perhaps from coastal Anatolia. Others may already have lived in Canaan and gradually became part of this emerging society. Over time, these groups developed a shared identity within the southern coastal plain. Historians call this process ethnogenesis. It describes the formation of a new people from multiple earlier communities. The Philistines, in this view, were not simply immigrants preserving an unchanged homeland culture. They became something entirely new. Their identity emerged through interaction, adaptation, and shared experience within the Levant itself. Some of the strongest evidence supporting connections with the Aegean comes not from weapons or monuments, but from pottery. Ancient pottery is one of archaeology's greatest tools. Unlike wood or textiles, fired clay survives for thousands of years. Styles change over time. Decorative patterns vary between regions. Manufacturing techniques reveal cultural traditions passed from one generation to another. When archaeologists excavated early Philistine settlements, they noticed something remarkable. Certain vessels looked strikingly similar to ceramics produced in the Mycenaean world. Bowls, craters, storage jars, and drinking vessels displayed familiar shapes. Painted decorations included spirals, birds, fish, geometric bands, and floral designs associated with Aegean artistic traditions. These similarities were too numerous to dismiss as coincidence. Yet the pottery was not identical. Local materials influenced production. Regional preferences altered decoration. New forms emerged that combined foreign inspiration with Levantine innovation. The result was not simply imported Greek pottery. It was the birth of a distinctly Philistine ceramic tradition. And this was only the beginning of the evidence. When archaeologists looked beyond pottery to architecture, food, technology, and even ancient DNA, an even richer story started to unfold. The emergence of Philistine culture was not marked by a single dramatic moment that changed everything overnight. Instead, it unfolded gradually across decades. The Old Bronze Age world had fractured. Great kingdoms had weakened or disappeared. Regional powers that once dictated the affairs of smaller cities could no longer project the same level of authority. Into this changing landscape came new opportunities. Communities reorganized. Trade routes shifted. Political alliances were renegotiated. New identities began to take shape. The southern coastal plain of the Levant was one of the regions transformed by these changes. Stretching along the eastern Mediterranean, this fertile landscape enjoyed advantages that had attracted settlers for thousands of years. Rich agricultural land lay behind the coastline. Rivers and seasonal streams nourished fields. Roads connected inland communities with ports facing the wider Mediterranean. Whoever controlled this region possessed valuable farmland, as well as access to maritime trade. Over time, 5 major cities came to dominate this coastal territory. Together, they would later become known as the Philistine Pentapolis. Although modern historians often speak of these cities as a single political entity, the reality appears to have been considerably more complex. The northernmost was Ekron. South of it lay Gath. Closer to the sea stood Ashdod. Along the Mediterranean coast rose Ashkelon. At the southern end of the network stood Gaza. Each city possessed its own leadership. Each managed its own affairs. Each developed local traditions. They cooperated when common interests demanded it. They could also pursue independent policies when circumstances changed. Rather than a centralized kingdom ruled by one monarch, the evidence suggests a loose confederation of powerful city-states. This pattern was not unusual in the ancient Near East. Throughout the region, many societies organized themselves around influential urban centers rather than unified territorial states. Loyalty often focused first on one city. Regional cooperation came second. Archaeology has shown that several of these Philistine cities existed long before the Philistines themselves emerged as a recognizable cultural group. Many had originally been Canaanite settlements. Their streets, defensive walls, and earlier buildings reflected centuries of local history. Instead of erasing this past, the newcomers inherited it. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of Philistine civilization. Their society was not created on empty land. It developed within cities already shaped by generations of Canaanite life. Existing populations did not simply vanish. Instead, archaeological evidence points toward coexistence, adaptation, and cultural blending. The houses built during the earliest Philistine period reveal this process remarkably well. Some structures continued older Levantine traditions. Others introduced floor plans and architectural details more commonly associated with the Aegean world. In many neighborhoods, both styles existed side by side. This was not cultural replacement. It was cultural interaction. Excavations at Ashkelon have revealed neighborhoods filled with workshops, storage facilities, domestic buildings, and public spaces. Daily life appears to have been highly organized. Streets followed plan layouts. Specialized areas were devoted to different economic activities. The city was not a temporary military camp established by invaders. It was a thriving urban community invested in long-term prosperity. Similar discoveries have emerged from Ekron. During the Iron Age, Ekron grew into one of the largest cities in the region. Massive industrial installations uncovered their demonstrate large-scale olive oil production. Archaeologists identified dozens of olive presses operating simultaneously. Together, they represent one of the biggest olive oil industries yet discovered from the ancient Near East. Olive oil served countless purposes in antiquity. It was food. It fueled lamps. It formed the basis of perfumes and cosmetics. It played important roles in religious rituals. It functioned as an important commercial product traded across the eastern Mediterranean. The scale of production at Ekron suggests an economy capable of generating significant agricultural surplus. This was not subsistence farming alone. These communities were producing for regional markets. Wine formed another important element of Philistine agriculture. The Mediterranean climate favored vineyards. Grapes flourished on the surrounding hills and plains. Presses recovered at archaeological sites indicate systematic wine production. Amphorae and storage jars reveal methods for preserving and transporting the finished product. Alongside olives and grapes grew wheat, barley, legumes, figs, and numerous other crops common throughout the Levant. Animal husbandry also played an essential role. Sheep and goats provided wool, milk, and meat. Cattle supplied labor for plowing fields in addition to food. One feature of Philistine diet has attracted particular scholarly attention. Pig remains appear in significantly greater numbers at many Philistine settlements than at neighboring Israelite sites. This difference has long intrigued archaeologists. The explanation, however, is not entirely straightforward. Earlier generations often treated pig consumption as a simple ethnic marker separating Philistines from Israelites. Modern research paints a more complicated picture. Environmental conditions mattered. Pigs require abundant water and shade compared with sheep or goats. Coastal regions with higher rainfall could support them more easily than the drier interior highlands. Economic choices also influenced livestock management. Cultural preferences certainly played a role as well. Rather than relying upon one explanation alone, most historians now see dietary patterns as the result of several interacting factors. Another remarkable line of evidence comes from botanical remains. Archaeologists recover seeds, pollen, charred plant fragments, and microscopic residues during excavations. These tiny discoveries reveal surprising details about ancient agriculture. Some plants appear to have become more common in the southern Levant during the early Philistine period. Coriander is one example frequently discussed by researchers. Whether introduced directly by migrants or simply becoming more widespread through expanding trade, it reflects the changing agricultural landscape of the Iron Age. Technology also evolved. Pottery kilns became increasingly sophisticated. Metallurgical workshops demonstrate advanced knowledge of bronze and ironworking. Textile production expanded through the use of loom weights and spinning equipment recovered from numerous sites. These discoveries remind us that ancient cities depended upon skilled labor. Potters shaped clay into vessels used every day. Smiths forged tools and weapons. Carpenters built doors, roofs, furniture, and carts. Weavers transformed wool and flax into clothing. Stonemasons cut blocks for monumental buildings. Bakers supplied bread. Farmers sustained the urban population. Merchants distributed goods between communities. Every city functioned because thousands of ordinary people performed specialized work. Among the most recognizable products of Philistine craftsmanship remained their pottery. As the generations passed, the earliest Aegean-inspired ceramics gradually developed into an unmistakable local tradition. Bright red and black painted designs decorated elegant vessels. Birds spread their wings across curved surfaces. Fish swam beneath carefully painted geometric bands. Spirals, concentric circles, and stylized flowers reflected artistic influences stretching across the Mediterranean while taking on new local character. These vessels were not simply decorative. They held food. They stored liquids. They accompanied feasts. They served religious rituals. Broken fragments scattered through houses allow archaeologists to reconstruct aspects of everyday life that written texts never recorded. Architecture reveals equally fascinating developments. Certain Philistine buildings incorporated broad halls supported by columns. Some featured hearths unlike those commonly found in earlier Canaanite houses. Stone benches lined interior walls. Carefully prepared floors demonstrate attention to domestic comfort. Yet once again, no single foreign blueprint explains everything. Local traditions remained visible throughout the cities. Builders selected ideas from multiple architectural traditions rather than copying one style exactly. The same pattern appears in metalworking. Excavations at sites associated with Philistine occupation have uncovered evidence of highly skilled craftsmanship. Bronze objects display careful casting techniques. Iron gradually became more common during this period, although bronze remained important for many applications. Contrary to older popular beliefs, there is little archaeological evidence that the Philistines possessed some secret monopoly over iron technology. Ironworking spread gradually across the region through complex processes involving experimentation, trade, and technological adaptation. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age did not occur instantly. For centuries, both metals continued to be used side by side. One of the greatest surprises from archaeological excavations concerns weaponry. Considering the Philistines' reputation as fierce warriors, many people expect their cities to contain enormous quantities of military equipment. The evidence does not support that expectation. Weapons certainly existed. Spears, arrowheads, swords, and armor have all been discovered, but their numbers generally resemble those found at other contemporary settlements. Philistine cities do not appear unusually militarized compared with neighboring societies. This observation serves as an important reminder. Ancient reputations often exaggerate certain characteristics. The biblical narrative naturally emphasizes warfare because conflict drives the story forward. Archaeology, however, uncovers entire communities whose lives extended far beyond the battlefield. Children grew up within these cities. Families prepared meals. Craftsmen perfected their trades. Farmers worried about rainfall. Merchants negotiated prices. Religious ceremonies marked the changing seasons. Weddings were celebrated. Funerals honored the dead. Most people spent far more time working, raising families, and maintaining their communities than fighting wars. Burial customs provide another window into Philistine society. Cemeteries excavated in recent decades have transformed scholarly understanding of these people. Graves contained pottery, jewelry, personal ornaments, and occasionally weapons. The arrangement of burials reflects beliefs about death and remembrance, although many aspects remain uncertain because written explanations have not survived. Scientific analysis has expanded this picture even further. Isotope studies reveal information about diet and geographic mobility. DNA extracted from ancient skeletons has opened entirely new avenues of research. One particularly significant genetic study published in recent years examined individuals buried at Ashkelon. The results suggested that some people living there during the early Iron Age possessed genetic ancestry linked to populations from southern Europe. This finding aligns with archaeological evidence pointing toward movement from the wider Mediterranean into the Levant during the period when Philistine culture emerged. At the same time, the study revealed something equally important. Within only a few generations, this distinctive genetic signal had become greatly diluted through intermarriage with local populations. In other words, newcomers and long-established inhabitants rapidly became one community. This scientific evidence mirrors what archaeology had already begun to suggest. The Philistines were not an isolated foreign colony preserving rigid ethnic boundaries. They became part of the Levantine world remarkably quickly. Language remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries. We still do not know exactly what language the earliest Philistines spoke. We possess only scattered clues. Some personal names appear to have Indo-European connections. Others are clearly Semitic. The titles used for rulers have inspired decades of scholarly debate. Yet no extensive Philistine literature has survived to settle the question. Most likely, multiple languages coexisted within these cities during their early history. Merchants needed to communicate with neighboring peoples. Local Canaanite traditions remained influential. New arrivals brought their own speech. Over time, these linguistic worlds almost certainly blended, just as architecture, pottery, and religion blended. Every new discovery has made the Philistines appear less like the one-dimensional villains remembered from later traditions and more like a dynamic society adapting to one of history's most turbulent eras. Yet despite their growing prosperity, their story was about to become deeply intertwined with another emerging people living beyond the fertile coastal plain. In the hill country to the east, small communities were also changing. Over time, they would develop identities that later generations remembered as the Israelites. The relationship between these neighboring societies would become one of the most famous rivalries in ancient history. But the reality behind that rivalry was far more complicated than simple tales of heroes and enemies. By the time the Philistine cities had grown into prosperous urban centers, the political landscape of the southern Levant was changing once again. The old imperial order had largely disappeared. Egypt still remained an important power, but its direct control over Canaan had weakened considerably compared with earlier centuries. This left room for new regional societies to emerge. Along the Mediterranean coast, the Philistine cities flourished. In the central hill country to the east, smaller settlements expanded into communities that would eventually become associated with ancient Israel. For centuries, the relationship between these neighboring peoples has often been imagined as one of constant warfare. That impression comes primarily from the Hebrew Bible. Battles dominate the narrative. Heroes confront enemies. Cities rise and fall. Victories are celebrated as acts of divine favor. Defeats become lessons in faithfulness or disobedience. These stories are among the most influential in world literature. Yet historians must ask an important question. Did everyday life actually resemble an endless battlefield? The archaeological evidence suggests something much more complicated. The Philistine cities and the Israelite settlements did indeed compete at times. Control over fertile valleys, trade routes, and strategic roads mattered enormously. Political ambitions naturally led to conflict, but neighboring societies also traded with one another. Craftsmen échangent techniques. Farmers bought and sold agricultural products. Families living near the frontier almost certainly interacted on a regular basis. Peaceful contact often leaves fewer dramatic traces than war, yet it is just as much a part of history. The geography of the region helps explain why these two societies developed differently. The Philistines occupied the fertile coastal plain and the rolling foothills known today as the Shephelah. Rainfall was relatively dependable. Broad valleys supported large-scale agriculture. Roads connected inland communities with Mediterranean ports. Wealth accumulated through farming, industry, and regional commerce. The early Israelite settlements, by contrast, spread across the hill country farther inland. The terrain was more rugged. Agricultural opportunities were more limited. Villages tended to be smaller. Communities relied heavily upon terraced farming, pastoralism, and local resources. These environmental differences shaped daily life. They also influenced political organization. Large urban centers naturally concentrated wealth and population. They required administrators, craftsmen, merchants, laborers, and religious officials. Smaller hill settlements developed different social structures. Leadership was often more localized. Extended families and tribal relationships appear to have played especially important roles during the earlier phases of Israelite history. Some modern historians therefore argue that many of the tensions described in later biblical tradition may reflect competition between different economic and geographic systems as much as deep ethnic hostility. Coastal cities and hill communities often wanted control over the same strategic corridors. Whoever held the valleys controlled movement between the coast and the interior. Whoever controlled those routes possessed important military and commercial advantages. This broader context helps explain why the biblical narratives repeatedly focus upon places lying between the Philistine plain and the Israelite highlands. Many famous battles occur precisely in these transitional landscapes. Valleys became natural invasion routes. Hills offered defensive positions. Small changes in territorial control could significantly affect regional power. Among the most famous stories connected with this frontier is the account of Samson. According to the book of Judges, Samson possessed extraordinary strength granted by God. His exploits against the Philistines became legendary. He defeated enemies in dramatic fashion. He carried away the gates of Gaza. He fought with astonishing physical power. Eventually, however, his relationship with Delilah led to his capture. The biblical narrative describes how she learned the secret associated with his strength. After his hair was cut, the Philistines seized him. He was blinded and imprisoned. In the final scene, Samson brought down the pillars of a great Philistine building, collapsing it upon himself and many of those gathered inside. From a historical perspective, it is difficult to determine how much of this account reflects actual events. The story belongs to a literary and religious tradition composed over generations. Historians cannot confirm the miraculous elements, nor can archaeology verify every detail. What the account does reveal, however, is how later Israelite writers remembered the relationship between their ancestors and the Philistines. The Philistines appear as the dominant regional power. Samson acts as an individual challenger rather than the leader of a powerful kingdom. This portrayal may preserve a memory of a period during which Philistine influence extended significantly into parts of the southern Levant. Another famous biblical claim concerns blacksmiths. One passage states that the Philistines prevented the Israelites from maintaining their own smiths, so they would not manufacture weapons. For many years, this passage encouraged the belief that the Philistines controlled advanced iron technology unavailable to their neighbors. Modern archaeology has prompted greater caution. Iron objects appear at many sites throughout the region during the early Iron Age. Their distribution reflects a gradual technological transition rather than an exclusive monopoly. Skilled metalworkers certainly existed in Philistine cities. They also existed elsewhere. The biblical passage may preserve a memory of political domination in certain areas, but it should not be understood as proof that only the Philistines knew how to work iron. The most famous encounter of all is, of course, the duel between David and Goliath. Few stories from antiquity have become more recognizable. A young shepherd armed with a sling confronts a towering warrior equipped with heavy armor and powerful weapons. Against every expectation, the giant falls. The underdog triumphs over overwhelming strength. Whether the event occurred exactly as described remains impossible to determine. Yet even here, historians find intriguing details worth examining. The biblical account describes Goliath's equipment with considerable specificity. His armor, helmet, shield, spear, and sword reflect military traditions known in the ancient Near East. Some scholars have suggested that the practice of champion warfare, in which individual representatives fought on behalf of larger armies, resembles customs known from parts of the Aegean world. This observation has been used to support the idea that elements of Philistine culture preserve memories of Mediterranean traditions carried eastward generations earlier. Such interpretations remain debated. Ancient military practices often spread between neighboring societies. Similar tactics do not necessarily prove direct cultural continuity. Nevertheless, the discussion illustrates how even familiar stories continue to generate new historical questions. The rise of David occupies a central place in biblical history. According to the narrative, he eventually united the Israelite tribes and defeated the Philistines in a series of campaigns. Their political dominance came to an end. Israel emerged as the leading regional kingdom. Archaeology provides a more cautious picture. There is growing evidence that some form of kingdom centered on Jerusalem existed during the 10th century before Christ. Exactly how large or powerful it was remains actively debated. Some scholars envision a substantial united monarchy. Others argue for a smaller regional state that expanded only gradually. Whatever the precise scale, it is clear that the balance of power shifted over time. Philistine influence no longer remained unchallenged. Neighboring kingdoms became increasingly capable of resisting coastal authority. Interestingly, despite biblical descriptions of victory, there is little evidence that the Israelite kingdom permanently occupied all the Philistine cities during this early period. The Pentapolis continued to exist. Local rulers remained active. The cities adapted to changing political realities rather than disappearing immediately after military defeat. This reflects a common pattern in ancient history. Defeat in one campaign rarely ended a civilization overnight. Cities paid tribute, alliances shifted, dynasties changed, political fortunes rose and fell across generations. The Philistine cities continued functioning as important urban centers long after many of the famous biblical episodes traditionally associated with them. Religion also played an important role in shaping the image of the Philistines preserved in biblical tradition. The Bible frequently presents confrontations not merely between armies, but between gods. Victories carried theological meaning. Defeat could be interpreted as divine judgment. Captured sacred objects became powerful symbols. One famous example concerns the Ark of the Covenant. According to the narrative, the Philistines captured the Ark after defeating the Israelites in battle. They placed it inside the temple of their own deity, Dagon. The following morning, the statue of Dagon was found fallen before the Arkansas. Subsequent disasters convinced the Philistines that the sacred object should be returned. Whether the story records a historical memory, a theological lesson, or a combination of both remains uncertain. What clearly demonstrates is that sacred objects occupied central places within ancient political culture. Victorious armies often seized the religious treasures of defeated enemies. Assyrian kings carried away divine statues from conquered cities. Babylonian rulers did the same. Such acts symbolized not only military success, but also the apparent superiority of one nation's gods over another's. The Philistines themselves almost certainly understood religion in similar ways. Their temples served as centers of worship, public ceremony, and communal identity. Priests oversaw rituals. Offering so devain favor. Festivals united the population through shared traditions. Although many details remain unknown because the Philistines left few written records, archaeology has recovered temple structures, altars, incense stands, figurines, and ritual objects that demonstrate an active and sophisticated religious life. Their beliefs reflected the same cultural blending visible throughout every other aspect of their civilization. Some deities appear connected with older Canaanite traditions. Others may preserve influences from the wider Mediterranean world. Local practices evolved over generations as communities adapted to changing circumstances. Far from existing in isolation, the Philistines participated in the religious diversity that characterized the entire ancient Near East. Yet while the Philistine cities continued to prosper, an even greater danger was beginning to rise far beyond the horizon. To the northeast, along the upper Tigris River, a kingdom was transforming itself into one of the most formidable military powers the ancient world had ever seen. Its armies marched with ruthless discipline. Its kings demanded absolute submission. Its engineers mastered the art of siege warfare. One by one, independent kingdoms across the Near East would be forced to acknowledge its supremacy. For the Philistine cities, the greatest struggle in their history was no longer with their neighbors in the hill country. A far larger empire was now moving steadily toward the Mediterranean coast. For generations, the Philistine cities had adapted to changing political conditions. They had witnessed the decline of Egyptian authority. They had competed with neighboring kingdoms. They had grown wealthy through agriculture, craftsmanship, and regional trade. Their cities had become some of the most prosperous urban centers along the southern Mediterranean coast. Yet all of those earlier challenges would soon seem small compared with what was approaching from the northeast. The Neo-Assyrian Empire had begun its extraordinary rise. Although Assyria had existed for centuries, it was during the 8th century before Christ that it transformed into an empire unlike anything the Levant had experienced before. Earlier kings had expanded Assyrian influence through warfare, but the rulers of this period reshaped nearly every aspect of the state. The army became larger. Campaigns became more systematic. Administration became more centralized. Roads connected distant provinces. Governors answered directly to the king. Tribute flowed steadily toward the imperial capital. Assyria did not simply conquer territories. It reorganized them. When Tiglath-Pileser III came to the throne in 745 BC, he inherited a kingdom with enormous ambitions. During the following years, he launched campaign after campaign across the Near East. Kingdoms that had enjoyed independence for centuries suddenly found themselves facing disciplined armies supported by sophisticated logistics and experienced commanders. The Assyrian military was feared throughout the ancient world. Its soldiers carried iron weapons of exceptional quality. Archers operated alongside spearmen and infantry. Chariots remained important symbols of elite warfare, although cavalry was becoming increasingly significant. Engineers accompanied military expeditions to construct siege ramps, battering rams, bridges, and fortified camps. Every campaign reflected careful planning. Perhaps even more intimidating than the army itself was Assyria's reputation. Royal inscriptions proudly described the destruction of rebellious cities. They recounted victories in dramatic language. Kings celebrated themselves as chosen by the gods to impose order upon the world. Captured rulers were publicly humiliated. Heavy tribute was demanded from those allowed to remain in power. Modern readers should remember that these inscriptions served political purposes. Assyrian kings wanted both their own subjects and their enemies to fear imperial power. The texts, therefore, emphasized overwhelming strength. Nevertheless, archaeology confirms that Assyria possessed remarkable military capabilities and exercised enormous influence across the Near East. As Assyrian expansion reached the Levant, the Philistine cities found themselves directly in its path. Their location, once a tremendous advantage for trade, now became a strategic liability. Whoever controlled the coastal plain controlled one of the principal routes between Mesopotamia and Egypt. Every empire seeking dominance over the eastern Mediterranean recognized the importance of this corridor. For the Assyrians, allowing independent city-states to occupy such a crucial region was unacceptable. Campaigns gradually brought much of Syria and the Levant under imperial authority. Kingdom after kingdom submitted. Some surrendered without prolonged resistance. Others fought desperately. In either case, Assyria expected tribute, loyalty, and obedience. The Philistine cities faced difficult choices. Should they submit peacefully and preserve a measure of local autonomy? Should they resist and risk destruction? Should they seek support from Egypt, whose rulers still hoped to limit Assyrian expansion? Each city answered these questions somewhat differently. This is another reminder that the Pentapolis was never a unified nation acting with one voice. Local rulers pursued their own interests. Alliances shifted according to circumstance. Decisions made in one city did not automatically bind the others. Some accepted Assyrian authority while attempting to preserve internal stability. Others rebelled when opportunities appeared. These differing responses sometimes created tensions even among neighboring Philistine cities. Egypt encouraged resistance whenever possible. Although Egyptian political influence in Canaan had declined dramatically since the late Bronze Age, the pharaohs still regarded the Levant as an essential buffer against foreign powers. An expanding Assyrian empire reaching the borders of Egypt represented a serious strategic threat. Rather than confronting Assyria directly in every instance, Egyptian rulers often supported local rebellions. Diplomatic envoys traveled between courts. Promises of assistance circulated. Subject kingdoms weighed their options carefully. For many rulers, rebellion offered hope. If enough cities rose simultaneously, perhaps Assyrian authority could be broken. If Egyptian armies intervened at the right moment, perhaps independence could be restored. These hopes repeatedly proved overly optimistic. One of the most dramatic confrontations occurred during the reign of Sargon II. Around 711 BC, Ashdod became the center of a major revolt against Assyrian rule. Tribute was withheld. Imperial authority was openly challenged. The rebellion attracted attention throughout the region because many smaller states watched carefully to see whether Assyria could be defeated. The response came swiftly. Assyrian armies marched toward the rebellious city. Their objective was not merely to defeat an enemy force. It was to send a message to every province under imperial control. Ashdod fell. Ancient inscriptions proudly recorded the victory. Archaeological evidence supports the conclusion that the city suffered severe disruption during this period. Defensive systems were overcome. Political authority was reorganized. Following such victories, Assyria often implemented policies designed to prevent future revolts. One of the best known was population resettlement. Contrary to popular imagination, these deportations did not necessarily involve the complete removal of entire populations. Instead, substantial numbers of people, particularly political elites, skilled craftsmen, administrators, and influential families, could be relocated to distant parts of the empire. At the same time, other populations from elsewhere might be settled in the newly conquered region. The goal was practical rather than purely punitive. Communities separated from their traditional power bases found organized rebellion more difficult. Skilled workers contributed to economic development throughout the empire. Diverse populations became increasingly dependent upon imperial administration. Assyria applied these methods across many conquered regions. Israelites experienced them. Arameans experienced them. Babylonians experienced them. The Philistines experienced them as well. For the inhabitants of the coastal cities, these policies gradually altered the character of their communities. Some families disappeared from their ancestral homes. Newcomers arrived, speaking different languages and bringing different customs. Local traditions continued, but they did so within an increasingly imperial framework. Even under Assyrian domination, however, economic life did not simply stop. Empires depended upon productive provinces. Farmers continued cultivating fields. Olive presses remained active. Vineyards still required careful attention each season. Workshops continued producing pottery, textiles, and metal goods. Tribute itself depended upon prosperity. An impoverished province could contribute little to the imperial treasury. Consequently, Assyria generally preferred functioning cities that generated wealth, provided taxes, and remained politically obedient. Excavations at Ekron reveal just how prosperous one Philistine city became during this imperial period. The enormous olive oil industry expanded dramatically. Archaeologists uncovered more than 100 olive oil installations dating to the 7th century BC. The scale is astonishing. Thousands upon thousands of liters of oil could have been produced annually. This industrial activity demonstrates that Philistine cities retained considerable economic importance even while subject to Assyrian authority. Imperial domination did not necessarily mean cultural extinction. Local traditions often survived for generations. People continued speaking familiar languages. Religious practices adapted but persisted. Daily routines carried on despite changing political circumstances. The relationship between Assyria and the Philistine cities, therefore, cannot be reduced to constant oppression alone. It was a complex mixture of coercion, taxation, administration, opportunity, and control. Some local elites even benefited from cooperation with the empire. Loyal rulers could retain significant authority so long as tribute arrived punctually and imperial interests remained protected. Nevertheless, rebellion never disappeared entirely. Whenever Assyria appeared weakened by succession crises or distant wars, hopes for independence resurfaced. One important episode unfolded during the reign of King Hezekiah of Judah. Seeking freedom from Assyrian domination, Hezekiah organized a broader anti-Assyrian coalition. Some Philistine cities joined this effort. Others remained loyal to Assyria. Once again, the Pentapolis acted according to local interests rather than unified national policy. Ekron became a focal point of the conflict. Its leadership appears to have been divided between factions supporting rebellion and factions favoring continued loyalty to Assyria. Internal political struggles added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. When King Sennacherib succeeded to the Assyrian throne, he moved decisively against the rebellion. His campaign through the Levant ranks among the best documented military expeditions of the ancient world because both Assyrian inscriptions and the Hebrew Bible preserve accounts from different perspectives. Sennacherib's own records emphasize overwhelming victory. Cities surrendered or were captured. Tribute poured into Assyria. Rebellious rulers were punished. The biblical narrative focuses instead upon the kingdom of Judah and the survival of Jerusalem. Although the two traditions differ in emphasis, archaeology confirms that Sennacherib's campaign had profound consequences across the region. Many cities suffered destruction. Others submitted before prolonged sieges became necessary. The famous Assyrian reliefs depicting the siege of Lachish provide extraordinary visual evidence of imperial warfare during this era. Although Lachish was a Judean city rather than a Philistine one, the scenes illustrate exactly the kind of military operations that terrified neighboring populations. Massive battering rams advanced toward fortified walls. Archers provided covering fire. Defenders hurled stones from towers. Siege ramps climbed steadily upward toward the city's defenses. Every detail reflects remarkable military organization. The Philistine cities understood exactly what resistance could cost. Some survived by accommodating imperial demands. Others suffered greatly after rebellion. Yet despite repeated campaigns, deportations, and political upheaval, Philistine identity did not disappear immediately. Their cities remained inhabited. Their artisans continued producing distinctive material culture. Their economy remained active. Their traditions endured, although increasingly shaped by life within a vast multinational empire. Still, history had one more dramatic turn waiting for them. The Assyrian Empire, seemingly invincible during its height, would not last forever. Like every empire before it, it too would eventually face internal struggles, external enemies, and unexpected collapse. For the Philistines, however, the fall of Assyria would not bring the freedom they had hoped for. A new empire was already preparing to inherit everything Assyria left behind. And under its kings, the final chapter of Philistine history would begin. For a moment, it seemed as though the balance of power in the ancient Near East might change once again. The empire that had dominated the region for generations was beginning to fracture. Assyria, whose armies had marched from the mountains of Anatolia to the borders of Egypt, was showing signs of exhaustion. Decades of constant warfare had stretched its resources. Internal struggles weakened the royal court. Provincial governors became increasingly difficult to control. Long-standing enemies sensed an opportunity. No empire remains invincible forever. The Assyrians themselves had witnessed the fall of older kingdoms. Now they faced the same fate. Beginning in the late 7th century before Christ, a coalition of powers challenged Assyrian dominance. The Medes advanced from the east. The Babylonians rose under ambitious new rulers. Former subject peoples throughout the empire watched carefully as the political order began to unravel. One by one, Assyria's great cities came under attack. In 614 BC, the ancient city of Ashur fell. 2 years later, Nineveh, the magnificent imperial capital that had symbolized Assyrian power for generations, was captured after a brutal siege. Contemporary accounts describe fierce fighting and widespread destruction. Although Assyrian resistance continued for several years, the empire never recovered. For many smaller states, this moment appeared to offer hope. If the empire that had demanded tribute and crushed rebellions had disappeared, perhaps independence could finally return. But history rarely leaves a vacuum. Even before the last Assyrian strongholds had fallen, another kingdom was expanding rapidly. Babylon, once overshadowed by its northern rival, now emerged as the dominant power in Mesopotamia. Under King Nabopolassar and later his son Nebuchadnezzar II, the Neo-Babylonian Empire inherited much of Assyria's former territory. For the Philistine cities, this change brought little relief. The strategic importance of the southern Levant had not changed. Whoever ruled Mesopotamia still needed secure access to the Mediterranean coast. Trade routes still crossed the region. Egypt remained a powerful neighbor to the southwest. Any empire seeking lasting control would inevitably turn its attention toward the coastal plain. Nebuchadnezzar II is remembered today primarily because of his role in the history of Judah and Jerusalem. His conquest of Jerusalem and the subsequent Babylonian exile occupy a central place in biblical history. Yet the kingdoms and cities surrounding Judah also experienced the full force of Babylonian expansion. The Philistine cities were among them. Babylonian chronicles, together with archaeological evidence, reveal a series of military campaigns directed against rebellious cities throughout the Levant. Like the Assyrians before them, the Babylonians expected loyalty and tribute. Resistance was met with overwhelming force. One of the clearest examples is Ashkelon. Ashkelon had long been one of the wealthiest cities along the Mediterranean coast. Its harbor connected inland agricultural production with maritime trade. Merchants, craftsmen, sailors, and farmers all contributed to its prosperity. Thick defensive walls surrounded the city, reflecting both its wealth and the dangers of the ancient world. Around 604 BC, Nebuchadnezzar marched west after securing important victories elsewhere in the region. Babylonian records describe the capture of Ashkelon. Archaeological excavations have uncovered dramatic evidence consistent with a violent destruction dating to this period. Burned buildings, collapsed walls, layers of ash, everyday objects left behind where they had fallen. For archaeologists, destruction layers like these represent frozen moments in time. Aku king pot abandoned bazida achart. A storage jar shattered beneath collapsing masonry. Tools scattered across workshop floors. Each object tells a story about lives interrupted with little warning. Unlike gradual abandonment, sudden destruction often preserves remarkable details of daily life. The destruction of Ashkelon marked more than the fall of a single city. It signaled the collapse of one of the principal centers of Philistine civilization. Other Philistine cities also came under Babylonian control. Some surrendered, others resisted. The precise sequence differs from city to city, but the overall result was unmistakable. Political independence disappeared. Babylonian policy resembled earlier Assyrian practice in important respects. Rebellious populations could be deported. Skilled individuals were relocated to serve the needs of the empire. Administrative systems were reorganized. Local elites were replaced or brought under close supervision. The purpose was not simply punishment. It was long-term stability. When influential families were removed from their traditional centers of power, organizing future rebellions became far more difficult. Among those relocated were people from the Philistine cities. Cuneiform documents discovered in Babylonia mention individuals identified by their places of origin. Some are associated with Gaza, others with Ashkelon. These records demonstrate that people from Philistia lived hundreds of kilometers from their ancestral homeland under Babylonian rule. Remarkably, these individuals sometimes continued identifying themselves through the names of their native cities. Even after displacement, memories of home endured. This phenomenon appears repeatedly throughout history. Communities separated by conquest often preserve their identity for generations. Language, family traditions, religious customs, shared memories. These become powerful links connecting people to places they may never see again. For the Philistines, however, maintaining that identity became increasingly difficult with each passing generation. Back in the Levant, the surviving cities continued to change. New populations arrived. Old institutions weakened. Long-established political structures disappeared. The distinct cultural features that had once set Philistine society apart gradually blended into the broader world surrounding them. This process did not happen overnight. Cultures rarely vanish in a single dramatic moment. More often, they slowly transform. Children grow up speaking different languages. New rulers introduce new administrative systems. Religious traditions merge. Marriage connects previously separate communities. Economic life adapts to changing political realities. Generation after generation, the differences become less visible. By the time the Persian Empire conquered Babylon in the 6th century before Christ, the region formerly associated with the Philistines looked very different from the one that had emerged centuries earlier during the early Iron Age. The cities still existed. Agriculture continued. Trade resumed under new imperial administration. But the people were no longer recognized in historical sources as a distinct Philistine nation in the way they once had been. Instead, the coastal population increasingly became part of the wider cultural landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean. This raises an important historical question. Did the Philistines disappear? The answer depends upon what we mean by disappearance. They were not suddenly wiped out. There was no single event in which every Philistine community ceased to exist. Rather, their separate political identity gradually dissolved. Their distinctive material culture changed. Their cities became integrated into successive empires. Their descendants mixed with neighboring populations. In that sense, the Philistines experienced the same fate as many ancient peoples. The Hittites disappeared as an independent imperial power. The Assyrians eventually lost their empire. The Babylonians would also be conquered. Empires rise, kingdoms fall, but people themselves rarely vanish completely. They become part of the populations that follow. Modern archaeological science has reinforced this understanding. Ancient DNA studies, isotopic analysis, environmental archaeology, and careful excavation all point toward a world in which movement, migration, intermarriage, and cultural exchange were common features of life. The Philistines were not isolated strangers living apart from everyone else, nor were they a completely uniform people sharing identical origins. From the very beginning, their society appears to have been remarkably diverse. Individuals with ancestry linked to different parts of the Mediterranean settled alongside long-established inhabitants of Canaan. Their children inherited traditions from multiple worlds. New identities emerged through everyday life rather than through rigid separation. This may be one of the most important lessons their history offers today. Ancient civilizations were often far more interconnected than we sometimes imagine. Merchants crossed seas carrying goods and ideas. Craftsmen adopted foreign techniques. Soldiers served distant kings. Refugees searched for new homes. Families adapted to changing political landscapes. The Philistines stand as one example of how cultures are created not only through conquest, but also through exchange, adaptation, and resilience. Their story is therefore much richer than the familiar image preserved in later tradition. For centuries, they were remembered almost exclusively as the enemies of someone else's history. Archaeology has given them back something they lacked for thousands of years: their own place within the story of the ancient Mediterranean. When people think about the ancient Philistines, the first images that usually come to mind are warriors standing in formation. Massive city walls, bronze weapons glinting beneath the sun, giants challenging young shepherds to combat, armies marching across dusty valleys. Yet those moments, dramatic as they may have been, occupied only a tiny fraction of a person's life. For the overwhelming majority of Philistines, history was not made on battlefields. It was made in homes, in fields, in workshops, in marketplaces, and in temples. As the sun rose over cities like Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gaza, and Gath, thousands of ordinary people began their daily routines. Bakers prepared bread before dawn. Farmers gathered their tools before heading toward the surrounding countryside. Potters opened their workshops and inspected kilns that had burned through the night. Merchants arranged goods for sale in busy streets. Children helped their parents with household tasks while learning the skills they would one day depend upon themselves. Life followed rhythms that had changed little over generations. Agriculture remained the foundation of everything. A successful harvest meant food, trade, taxes, and stability. A poor harvest could bring hunger, debt, and uncertainty. Every season demanded careful planning. In autumn, fields were prepared for planting. Farmers guided oxen pulling wooden plows across fertile soil. Seeds were scattered by hand. The coming rains would determine whether those seeds flourished or failed. Winter brought cooler weather and precious rainfall. Streams filled once again. Hillsides turned green. Livestock grazed on fresh vegetation. Throughout the countryside, people watched the skies carefully, knowing that too little rain threatened crops while too much could wash away valuable soil. Spring marked the busiest period. Grain ripened beneath the warming sun. Entire families participated in the harvest. Sickles cut wheat and barley before bundles were gathered together for threshing. Grain was separated from its stalks and stored in large jars or granaries where it could feed communities throughout the coming year. Summer brought another set of important tasks. Grapes reached maturity in vineyards. Olives slowly developed on carefully tended trees. Fruit was collected, sorted, and processed. Every household understood that preserving food mattered just as much as growing it. Olive oil production became one of the defining industries of Philistine society. The process required patience and experience. Freshly harvested olives were crushed beneath heavy stone wheels. The resulting paste was spread into woven baskets or mats. Pressure was then applied using large wooden beams and carefully balanced stone weights. Slowly, valuable oil emerged and flowed into collection vessels below. The finest oil could be used for cooking or exported through regional trade. Other grades supplied lamps that illuminated homes after sunset. Oils also played roles in cosmetics, religious ceremonies, and medicine. Archaeologists have uncovered entire industrial districts devoted to this process. Massive installations at Ekron demonstrate organization on an impressive scale. Hundreds of workers may have participated during harvest seasons. The amount of oil produced suggests not only local consumption, but commercial distribution across neighboring regions. Wine production followed similar patterns. Grapes were gathered by hand and carried to stone presses. Workers crushed the fruit beneath their feet, allowing juice to flow into lower collection basins. Fermentation transformed fresh juice into wine over the following weeks. Finished wine was stored in large ceramic jars sealed carefully against spoilage. Wine accompanied meals, religious ceremonies, celebrations, and diplomatic gatherings. It represented both an everyday beverage and a valuable trade commodity. Markets reflected the diversity of Philistine society. Farmers arrived carrying baskets filled with vegetables, fruit, grain, or livestock. Fishermen offered their latest catches from the Mediterranean coast. Potters displayed freshly fired bowls, storage jars, cooking pots, and elegant painted vessels. Metalworkers presented knives, tools, ornaments, and farming equipment. Textile producers sold woven fabrics dyed in a variety of colors. The sounds would have been constant. Animals calling, merchants negotiating prices, children laughing, craftsmen striking metal with hammers, pottery clinking together, conversations taking place in more than one language as traders from different communities met to exchange goods. Archaeological discoveries suggest that Philistine cities contained specialized neighborhoods devoted to different occupations. Certain areas concentrated industrial production. Others consisted mainly of residential buildings. Public spaces allowed commerce and administration to function efficiently. The organization of these cities demonstrates careful planning rather than random growth. Homes varied according to wealth and occupation. Some consisted of only a few rooms surrounding a small courtyard. Others belonged to prosperous families and included larger storage facilities, additional living spaces, and more elaborate construction techniques. Most households revolved around the courtyard. Here meals could be prepared. Grain could be ground into flour using heavy stone querns. Clothing could be woven. Children played while remaining within sight of parents and grandparents. Domestic animals might be sheltered nearby during parts of the year. Households were rarely occupied by only parents and young children. Extended families often lived together or close to one another. Grandparents contributed knowledge gained through decades of experience. Older children helped care for younger siblings. Skills passed naturally from one generation to the next. Education, in the modern sense, looked very different from today. Most learning occurred through observation and participation. A potter's child learned pottery. A farmer's child learned farming. Daughters and sons alike acquired practical knowledge essential for adult responsibilities within their communities. Craftsmanship reached remarkably high standards. Philistine pottery remains among the most recognizable archaeological discoveries from the Iron Age Levant. Every vessel required numerous, carefully executed steps. Clay first had to be collected and prepared. Stones and impurities were removed. Water was mixed into the material until it reached the proper consistency. Skilled hands shaped vessels upon the wheel. Surfaces were smoothed carefully before painted decoration was applied. Finally, the pottery entered kilns where carefully controlled temperatures transformed fragile clay into durable ceramic. Mistakes at any stage could ruin days of work. Metal workers faced similar challenges. Bronze required precise mixtures of copper and tin. Iron demanded even higher temperatures and careful control during forging. Every axe, knife, spearhead, or farming tool represented hours of specialized labor. Textile production occupied much of daily life as well. Excavated loom weights found throughout Philistine settlements testify to widespread weaving. Wool from sheep and flax fibers were spun into thread before being woven into cloth. Clothing required enormous amounts of labor long before sewing even began. Dyes added color and status. Some pigments were relatively common. Others remained expensive because they required rare materials or complex preparation. Jewelry completed personal appearance. Necklaces of beads crafted from stone, shell, glass, or precious materials appear regularly in archaeological excavations. Rings, bracelets, earrings, and decorative pins reflected both artistic taste and social identity. Religion remained woven into everyday experience. Temples stood among the most important buildings in Philistine cities. There were places where communities gathered during festivals, presented offerings, and sought divine favor. Excavated religious objects include incense burners, altars, figurines, offering tables, and ceremonial vessels. Together, they reveal rituals centered upon maintaining proper relationships between humans and the divine. Unlike later monotheistic traditions, Philistine religion belonged to the broader religious landscape of the ancient Near East. Multiple deities were honored. Different gods or goddesses could be associated with fertility, storms, warfare, harvests, or protection. Although much remains uncertain because written religious texts have not survived, archaeology demonstrates that worship formed an essential part of civic life. Festivals likely marked the agricultural calendar. Successful harvests inspired communal celebrations. Offerings expressed gratitude while asking for continued prosperity in the coming year. Music almost certainly accompanied these gatherings. While few instruments survive intact, archaeologists have discovered evidence for lyres, flutes, drums, and other musical traditions throughout the Eastern Mediterranean during this period. Singing and dancing probably accompanied religious ceremonies as well as family celebrations. Death, too, occupied an important place in Philistine society. Burial customs reveal concern for remembering the deceased. Graves often contained pottery, jewelry, and personal possessions placed alongside the dead. These objects may have reflected beliefs about the afterlife, expressions of respect, or long-standing family traditions. Excavated cemeteries remind us that behind every artifact stood an individual human life. Someone who laughed with friends, someone who worried about failed crops, someone who celebrated births and mourned losses, someone who lived through changing governments, shifting alliances, and uncertain times. Perhaps this is where archaeology makes its greatest contribution. Written sources often focus on kings, generals, and battles. Excavations recover the traces of ordinary people whose names history never recorded. A child's toy, a broken cooking bowl repaired instead of discarded, a spindle worn smooth after years of use, fingerprints accidentally preserved in drying clay before a pot entered the kiln. These quiet discoveries restore something invaluable. They remind us that ancient civilizations were built not only by rulers, but by countless individuals whose daily efforts sustained entire societies. The Philistines were no exception. For centuries, their reputation rested almost entirely upon stories told by others. Today, thanks to archaeology, their own cities, homes, workshops, temples, and cemeteries have begun telling their side of the story. And that story reveals a civilization far more complex, more adaptable, and more deeply connected to the wider ancient Mediterranean than anyone could have imagined only a century ago. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Philistines is not simply the civilization they built, but the way their memory survived long after their political power disappeared. Most ancient peoples eventually faded into history. Their cities became ruins. Their languages disappeared. Their customs merged into those of later populations. Yet the Philistines continued to live on in stories, not through their own writings, because almost none survived. Instead, they endured through the writings of others. This makes them unusual. When historians study ancient Egypt, they can read inscriptions carved by Egyptian kings themselves. When they study Assyria, they possess thousands of royal records, administrative tablets, diplomatic letters, and literary works. Babylon left behind libraries of clay tablets. Even smaller kingdoms occasionally preserve their own voices through inscriptions or official documents. The Philistines did not. That absence has shaped every modern discussion about them. Imagine trying to understand an entire nation while hearing only what its rivals had to say. Imagine attempting to reconstruct centuries of history using mostly the writings of neighboring peoples, each with their own political goals, religious beliefs, and cultural assumptions. That has been the challenge facing historians for generations. For much of modern scholarship, the biblical portrayal dominated almost every conversation. The Philistines appeared primarily as antagonists. Their identity seemed almost entirely defined by conflict. Little attention was given to the possibility that they possessed rich artistic traditions, sophisticated industries, thriving cities or complex religious practices. The growth of archaeology changed that picture dramatically. Beginning in the 19th century and accelerating throughout the 20th, archaeologists excavated more and more sites across the southern Levant. Layer by layer, buried cities emerged from beneath the soil. Walls that had not been seen for nearly 3,000 years came back into the light. Streets were uncovered. Houses reappeared. Workshops, temples, storage buildings, and defensive fortifications slowly revealed themselves. Each excavation added another piece to the puzzle. At first, researchers concentrated on identifying biblical locations. They hoped to connect archaeological discoveries directly with familiar stories. Over time, however, the questions became much broader. What did people eat here? How were houses constructed? What technologies were being used? Where did the raw materials originate? Which trade routes connected these cities to the wider Mediterranean? How did everyday life change from one century to the next? Instead of focusing only on kings and battles, archaeology began reconstructing entire societies. The Philistines became one of the clearest examples of how dramatically historical understanding can change when physical evidence complements written sources. Pottery provided some of the earliest breakthroughs. To someone unfamiliar with archaeology, broken pieces of ancient pottery may seem insignificant. Yet to archaeologists, they're among the most valuable discoveries possible. Pottery survives when wood rots. It survives when textiles decay. It survives fires, floods, and the collapse of buildings. Every generation produces vessels with slightly different shapes, decorations, and manufacturing techniques. Because of this, pottery allows archaeologists to date archaeological layers with remarkable precision. The distinctive painted ceramics associated with early Philistine settlements immediately attracted scholarly attention. Their similarities with Mycenaean pottery suggested long-distance cultural connections across the Mediterranean. Yet their differences demonstrated that something entirely new had developed after arrival in the Levant. This became one of the strongest arguments against older ideas that imagined cultures as fixed and unchanging. Instead, the archaeological record showed adaptation. People borrowed ideas. They modified traditions. They combined influences from different regions. New identities emerged naturally over time. Modern archaeological science has expanded these insights even further. Radiocarbon dating now provides increasingly accurate chronologies. Microscopic residue analysis reveals what ancient vessels once contained. Chemical studies identify the origins of clay used to produce pottery. Animal bones reveal changing dietary habits. Plant remains reconstruct ancient agriculture. Even tiny grains of pollen preserved in soil contribute information about past environments. Ancient DNA has perhaps attracted the greatest public attention. For decades, discussions of Philistine origins relied primarily upon pottery styles, architecture, and historical texts. Genetics introduced an entirely new source of evidence. The results have generally supported what archaeology had already begun to suggest. People connected to the broader Mediterranean did arrive in the southern Levant during the early Iron Age. Their arrival coincided broadly with the appearance of Philistine culture. Yet those newcomers quickly mixed with existing local populations. Within only a few generations, the population reflected both local Levantine ancestry and ancestry connected with regions farther west. This is important because it moves the discussion beyond overly simple ideas of invasion or replacement. History is rarely so absolute. Migration often creates new societies rather than eliminating old ones. Families form across cultural boundaries. Children inherit traditions from multiple backgrounds. Languages influence one another. Religious practices evolve. Material culture changes gradually rather than instantly. The Philistines appear to illustrate precisely this kind of historical process. They remind us that identity is not always inherited unchanged. Sometimes identity is created. This concept, known among historians as ethnogenesis, has become central to understanding many ancient societies. Rather than imagining the Philistines as a single people arriving from one homeland with one language and one unchanging culture, many scholars now view them as a community that formed within the Levant itself through interaction among diverse populations. Some individuals likely trace their ancestry to the Aegean world. Others descended from long-established Canaanite families. Still others may have arrived from Cyprus, Anatolia, or neighboring regions. Together, they built something new. Perhaps that explains why Philistine culture appears so distinctive. It was not simply preserving one older tradition. It was combining several traditions into something uniquely its own. The debate surrounding the Philistines also illustrates how historical interpretation continues to evolve. Questions that seemed settled 50 years ago are often reconsidered in light of new discoveries. Excavations continue every year. Previously unknown buildings are uncovered. Fresh inscriptions occasionally emerge. Scientific techniques become more sophisticated. Every discovery has the potential to reshape long-held assumptions. This is one of the strengths of historical research. History is not a fixed collection of answers. It is an ongoing investigation guided by evidence. When stronger evidence appears, responsible historians adjust their conclusions accordingly. The Philistines demonstrate this process exceptionally well. Once viewed almost exclusively through biblical tradition, they are now understood as participants in the wider cultural transformations that reshaped the Eastern Mediterranean after the Bronze Age collapse. They were builders of cities. They were skilled agricultural producers. They were craftsmen whose pottery remains immediately recognizable thousands of years later. They were merchants connected to regional exchange networks. They were religious communities honoring their own deities while adopting ideas from neighboring peoples. They lived through one of the most unstable periods in ancient history and adapted with remarkable success for several centuries. Ultimately, however, even successful societies cannot escape the larger forces of history forever. Imperial conquest transformed their political world. Assyria imposed its authority. Babylon completed the destruction of their independence. Gradually, the distinct identity that had emerged during the early Iron Age blended into the populations of later empires. Yet, disappearing as an independent people did not erase their historical importance. Quite the opposite. Today, the Philistines occupy a unique place in the story of the ancient Near East. They stand at the crossroads of several great historical developments. The collapse of the Bronze Age world, the movement of peoples across the Mediterranean, the emergence of new Iron Age societies, the rise of Israel and Judah, the expansion of Assyria, the conquest of Babylon. Their history connects all of these events into a single narrative stretching across centuries. Perhaps that is why they continue to fascinate historians, archaeologists, and readers alike. The more evidence we uncover, the more human they become. No longer merely villains in another civilization story. No longer remembered only through famous biblical episodes. Instead, they emerge as a complex society that contributed its own chapter to the history of the ancient Mediterranean. Their cities may have fallen. Their political independence may have ended. Their language may have disappeared. But beneath the fields and modern towns of the southern Levant, their legacy remained waiting for archaeologists to uncover it. Every pottery fragment, every foundation stone, every burial, every olive press, every inscription. Together, these discoveries allow a people who were once almost silent to speak again across the distance of 3,000 years. When the last recognizable traces of Philistine identity faded from the historical record, the world around them continued to change. The Persian Empire governed the lands where their great cities had once flourished. Later came the armies of Alexander the Great. Greek kingdoms followed. Then Roman rule spread across the eastern Mediterranean. Generation after generation, new peoples arrived, new languages were spoken, and new cultures left their mark upon the same ancient landscape. The cities themselves did not simply disappear. Gaza continued to be an important center for centuries. Ashkelon remained a thriving coastal city under successive empires. Ashdod, Ekron, and the region around ancient Gath all experienced periods of renewal, decline, rebuilding, and transformation. Their streets changed. Their temples were replaced. Their walls were repaired or abandoned. Yet beneath every new layer of construction, the remains of earlier civilizations quietly endured. For thousands of years, the memory of the Philistines survived primarily in religious tradition. Readers encountered them through the stories of Samson, through the battle between David and Goliath, through accounts of conflict with the Israelites. Those narratives became some of the most influential stories ever written. They shaped literature, art, music, and popular imagination across much of the world. But history rarely belongs to only one perspective. As archaeologists began uncovering the ancient cities of the southern Levant, another picture slowly emerged. Not one that erased the biblical tradition, not one that proved every ancient story true or false, but one that added depth, complexity, and humanity to a people who had long been known only through the words of others. Instead of finding a civilization defined solely by warfare, researchers found thriving urban communities. They found carefully planned streets, sophisticated industries, workshops filled with skilled craftsmen, storehouses packed with agricultural products, beautiful painted pottery, religious sanctuaries, family homes, cemeteries preserving the memories of ordinary people whose names have been lost to history. These discoveries remind us of something important. History is often written by those who survive. The voices that remain are not always the only voices that once existed. Sometimes entire cultures leave behind very few written words of their own. In those cases, archaeology becomes their language. A broken cooking pot can reveal eating habits. A loom weight speaks of weaving and textile production. Olive presses tell the story of farmers and merchants. Animal bones reveal changing diets. Ancient seeds reveal what people planted, harvested, and traded. Even microscopic traces preserved in the soil help reconstruct worlds that vanished thousands of years ago. The Philistines have become one of the greatest examples of how archaeology can transform historical understanding. They are no longer viewed simply as mysterious invaders appearing suddenly from across the sea, nor are they understood as a completely isolated people. Instead, they represent a society shaped by migration, adaptation, exchange, and innovation during one of the most turbulent periods in ancient history. The end of the Bronze Age was not merely an age of destruction. It was also an age of creation. Old kingdoms collapsed. New societies emerged. Technologies spread. Trade routes changed. Communities redefined themselves. The Philistines were part of that transformation. Their culture drew inspiration from several different worlds. Aegean influences appeared in pottery and architecture. Canaanite traditions remained deeply rooted in everyday life. Egyptian connections reflected centuries of interaction with the powerful kingdom to the south. Over time, these influences blended into something uniquely Philistine. This blending of traditions is one of the defining characteristics of human history. Civilizations rarely develop in complete isolation. Ideas travel with merchants. Technologies spread with craftsmen. Languages influence one another through trade and diplomacy. Beliefs evolve as neighboring communities interact across generations. The story of the Philistines illustrates this process with remarkable clarity. It also reminds us that history is never truly finished. Even now, archaeologists continue excavating ancient sites associated with Philistine civilization. New technologies make it possible to recover information that previous generations could never have imagined. Ground-penetrating radar reveals buried structures without disturbing them. Chemical analysis identifies where raw materials originated. Ancient DNA continues to improve our understanding of migration and ancestry. High-resolution dating techniques refine historical timelines year by year. Each excavation season raises new questions alongside new answers. What language did the earliest Philistines speak among themselves? How quickly did immigrant communities merge with local populations? What songs were sung during religious festivals? How were political decisions made inside each city? Which stories did Philistine parents tell their children around evening fires? Some of these questions may never be answered completely. That uncertainty is part of what makes ancient history so compelling. The absence of complete evidence does not end the search. It encourages careful investigation. Every artifact, every inscription, and every excavation adds another small piece to a puzzle that stretches back more than 3 millennia. Today, if you visit the archaeological sites connected with the Philistines, you will not find armies preparing for battle. You will not hear merchants bargaining in crowded marketplaces or potters tending their kilns. The voices of that world have long since faded. Instead, you will find weathered stones beneath an open sky, fragments of walls that once enclosed thriving neighborhoods, foundations of temples where generations gathered in worship, pieces of painted pottery resting in museum collections, preserved after surviving thousands of years beneath the earth. To many visitors, these remains appear quiet, but to historians and archaeologists, they are anything but silent. Every excavation tells another chapter of a story that was almost forgotten. Every discovery helps restore the lives of people who once worked those fields, sailed those shores, raised families within those cities, and watched the same Mediterranean horizon that can still be seen today. Perhaps that is the greatest legacy of the Philistines. They remind us that every civilization deserves to be understood on its own terms as far as the evidence allows. They remind us to question simple narratives. They remind us that the ancient world was connected by movement, exchange, and cultural interaction on a scale that still surprises us today. Most of all, they remind us that history is rarely a story of heroes on one side and villains on the other. It is the story of human beings living through extraordinary times, building cities, adapting to change, facing conquest, preserving traditions, leaving behind traces of their existence for future generations to discover. More than 3,000 years after the Philistines first appeared in the historical record, their civilization continues to inspire new research and new debate. The mystery that once surrounded them has not disappeared completely, but with every passing decade, that mystery becomes a little clearer. What began as the story of a people remembered mainly through the writings of their rivals has become something much larger. It has become the story of a resilient civilization that emerged from the collapse of an old world, flourished through creativity and adaptation, endured the pressures of great empires, and ultimately became part of the rich and complex tapestry of ancient Mediterranean history. And although their cities eventually fell, their identity faded, and their language was lost, the evidence they left behind continues to speak. As long as archaeologists continue to uncover their homes, their workshops, their temples, their tools, and their works of art, the Philistines will never truly disappear from history again. Their story, once nearly forgotten, has found its voice once more. And it continues to remind us that the ancient world was far more interconnected, far more diverse, and far more fascinating than any single source could ever tell. That is the enduring legacy of the Philistines. And that is where their remarkable journey through history comes to an end.